He looked like any ordinary rancher,
Yeah.
the kind of man who blended into the backdrop of the land he worked. Calloused hands, scuffed boots, and the quiet demeanor of someone who only spoke when words truly mattered. But when Silas Ward spotted his maid limping across the kitchen floor that morning, what he uncovered would rattle the sheriff's office in ways no one expected. The ranch house sat nestled in the valley like it belonged there, almost as if the land itself had risen up and shaped it from wood and sweat. It was all rough boards and honest construction, a place that breathed the work of a man who didn't cut corners. Silas had built that house himself, back when his hands were steadier and his back stronger, 15 years ago, every plank nailed with the same steady resolve he brought to everything else in his life. To him, the world made sense when you stuck to simple principles. Work hard, pay fair, and keep your damn word. He was the kind of man who paid his help exactly on time, never pried into where they came from, and didn't tolerate gossip. Mercy Whitmore had arrived just 3 months earlier, hat clutched tight in one hand, desperation written in the shadows beneath her young eyes. She couldn't have been more than 20, but her face carried the weight of something older, something broken. She needed a job. He needed help around the house. That was enough for both of them. Mercy didn't talk much, and Silas had no problem with that. In his experience, quiet folks were often the ones worth listening to, not because they had more to say, but because they knew when to say it. But that morning, something was different. Silas had just returned from checking the herd, his boots thudding against the porch planks, when he noticed her through the kitchen window. Mercy was moving like each step cost her something precious, her right leg dragging behind just enough to catch the eye. Every few moments she'd stop, reaching for a table's edge or gripping the back of a chair, her face tight with effort she clearly didn't want anyone to see. He paused there for a long moment, watching through the glass. It wasn't the first time he'd caught something strange in her movements, but today it was unmistakably worse. The way she leaned toward her left side, the way she crouched carefully to retrieve a spoon she'd dropped, slow and practiced, like she'd learned to do it without flinching. It reminded Silas of an old gelding he used to ride, the way it moved after a bad tumble. Hurting, but doing its best to hide it. He pushed the door open, the hinges greeting him with that familiar groan. Mercy straightened immediately, her spine stiff, trying to look normal, but he'd already seen too much. Her skin paled, and for the briefest second, something flickered in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Fear. It wasn't fear of him, not exactly, but it was paused on the cloth she'd been using to scrub the same patch of counter for the 3rd time. "Yes, sir. You're hurt." It wasn't a question. They both knew that. The silence that followed stretched out between them like a tight rope, thin and waiting to snap. Outside, a meadowlark called lazily from a nearby fence post, its song bright and careless in the still morning air. Inside, the only sounds were the slow tick of the mantel clock and the soft rhythm of Mercy's uneven breathing. When she finally turned to face him, Silas felt his jaw harden. Her bottom lip was split near the edge, the wound fresh enough to still look raw. A fading bruise colored her left cheekbone, mostly hidden beneath her hair, which she'd pulled forward like a curtain. But it was her eyes that hit him hardest. That flat, hollow look of someone who'd stopped expecting the world to be kind. "I fell," she said quickly, too quickly. "Clumsy of me. I tripped on the stairs last night." Silas placed his coffee cup down slowly, carefully. He'd heard a lot of lies in his life. This one sounded like all of them rolled into one. Empty, thin, false. "Show me the stairs," he said calmly. Mercy paled. "Ma'am," he said again, softer now. "The stairs you fell down. Let me see 'em." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. They both knew she had none. Her little cabin behind the house didn't have stairs. Just a single step up to the porch. Silas had built it himself. He knew every square inch of that place. Her lie hung in the air like old smoke, bitter and impossible to ignore. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her apron, and for a moment Silas thought she might come clean. But instead, she lifted her chin, steeling herself with a kind of stubborn pride that would have been admirable if it wasn't also so damn sad. "I should get back to work," she murmured. He didn't stop her, just watched as she turned away, each step careful and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly how much pain they could afford. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't the first time. The way she moved, the way she hid it. This was someone who'd learned to survive by being invisible. But as Silas watched her limp toward the pantry, something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let this slide. He was going to find out who had laid a hand on her. And when he did, that man, whoever he was going to understand what happened when you pushed someone who believed protecting what was his wasn't just an obligation. It was a sacred oath. The only thing Silas didn't know yet was whether the truth would be darker than he was prepared to face. Later that same afternoon, Silas did something he'd never done before. He watched his own land like it didn't belong. View of the narrow path that wound its way from town straight to Mercy's small cabin. His hands kept up the illusion of work, but his eyes told the real story, tracking every twitch of movement across his land with practiced calm. The sun had started to dip low, brushing the sky with amber when he spotted a lone rider approaching. Even at a distance, Silas could tell exactly who it was by the slouch in the saddle and the cocky sway of his shoulders. Deputy Vernon Briggs. The man rode with the smug confidence of someone who believed every stretch of dirt his horse touched belonged to him. His badge caught the fading sunlight, glinting with each bounce in the saddle like a flare demanding attention. Silas had never taken to Briggs. The deputy carried a streak of cruelty that ran deeper than a dried-up creek bed, and he wore his authority like a weapon, looking at folks like they owed him a debt just for drawing breath. He wasn't a man who served the law, he used it. Everyone in Cedar Falls knew it, but knowing and doing something about it were two different animals entirely. Briggs swung off his horse near Mercy's place and tied the reins to the post Silas had put up for guests. But nothing about this visit smelled official. The way Briggs darted his eyes around, checking over his shoulder, was too twitchy for business. Then came the knock, not polite, not friendly, the flat back of his hand rapping hard against the door, loud enough that Silas heard it clear as day from 50 yards out. The door opened almost instantly, like Mercy had been standing right behind it, waiting. From the barn, Silas couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but he didn't need to. The body language said everything. Briggs pushed inside without a word, no invitation offered, and Mercy stepped back like she'd been trained to move out of his way. Her posture was tense, her shoulders drawn, submission in motion. The door clicked shut behind them, and Silas felt his fingers curl involuntarily into fists. Everything in him wanted to storm across the yard and deal with it right then and there, the way his old man would have. No words, just knuckles and moral clarity. But something made him stay rooted. Maybe it was wisdom, maybe it was restraint, maybe it was knowing that rushing in might make things even worse for Mercy. Or maybe it was the gnawing instinct that he didn't yet know the whole story. 20 minutes crawled by. Slow, heavy, rage-filled minutes. Silas paced a tight circle into the earth, his jaw locked so tight his molars throbbed. When the cabin door finally creaked open, Briggs stepped out first. He looked smug, real smug. He adjusted his belt like a man who thought he'd just proven a point. Mercy stood in the doorway behind him, and even from that, Briggs mounted up, turned toward town, and rode off without a glance back, whistling a lazy tune that drifted on the air like a slap in the face. Mercy stayed in the doorway a moment longer, one hand gripping the frame like she needed it to stay on her feet. Then she slowly stepped back inside and shut the door. Silas remained there, motionless in the dusk, as the pieces clicked into place one by one. The whole ugly puzzle snapping together, a man in uniform with too much control and not enough conscience, a young woman trapped by fear, backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. Now he understood the limp. The only question left was what he was going to do about it. The next morning rolled in, heavy and dull. Gray clouds hung low like wool stretched over the valley, and the air felt full of something waiting to break. Silas hadn't slept. He'd laid there staring at the ceiling in the quiet dark, his mind circling around the same dark thoughts until dawn bled through the window. But by the time his boots hit the floor, his mind was made up. He found Mercy in the kitchen again, and she was moving even slower than the day before. Her head stayed down as she set his breakfast in front of him. She wouldn't meet his eyes, and he noticed her hair, pulled forward again, this time to hide the fresh bruises along her neck. Seeing them, something inside Silas hardened like iron gone cold. "Mercy," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She froze mid-pour, the coffee pot hovering just above his cup. "Deputy Briggs, he's been coming here, hasn't he?" Her hands began to shake. For a second, Silas thought the pot might slip from her grip. She managed to set it down on the table, but her movements were all jerky and uncertain. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I saw him," Silas said, his voice calm but sharp as a nail. "I saw him come to your cabin yesterday, and I saw your face after he left." He wasn't angry at her, but inside something twisted with fury. "How long's it been going on?" That cracked her. Her shoulders quivered. When she finally lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes shimmered with tears she hadn't let fall yet. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "He's a deputy." Her words spilled out in a rush, like a dam finally giving way under too much pressure. She told him everything. How she'd come to Cedar Falls 3 months ago, running from the kind of trouble that leaves bruises inside and out. How Briggs had spotted her on her first day, cornered her behind the general store, his charm rotting into threats before she had a chance to say no. "He said I was his now, whether I liked it or not," she said, barely above a whisper. "He said if I told—" Silas went completely still. He'd always known Vernon Briggs was a bully, a man who liked control. But this wasn't just abuse of power. This was evil. "Why didn't you leave town?" he asked softly. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "With what money? Where would I even go?" Her voice rose, bitter and exhausted. "He made sure everybody saw me as his property. No one would hire me, no one would touch me. You're the only one who gave me a chance." Silas rose from the table slowly, his hands firm and deliberate against the wood. When he spoke, it came with the weight of stone. "He's not going to lay another finger on you." "Mr. Ward, please," she said, her voice tight with panic. "You don't know these men. He'll either kill you or find a way to put you behind bars. They cover for each other. That badge protects him." But Silas was already moving toward the door. Something had clicked into place inside him. And it wasn't rage, it was something colder, something more resolute. He paused in the doorway and looked back. "You should know something about me, Mercy," he said. "I may not talk much, but when I say I'll do something, I do it. And I don't leave things undone." Then he stepped outside into the gray light, leaving her behind, caught between fear and something that looked a little like hope. The walk to town would take close to an hour, and that was just the right amount of time for Silas to decide how exactly he was going to end this. Cedar Falls sat in a shallow bowl between two hills. The buildings slouched like they were tired of standing. Main Street was quiet that morning, just a few folks going about their business. Silas walked right down the center of that street, boots crunching slow and steady. People turned to look. They always did when Silas Ward came to town. He only made the trip when something needed fixing. He found Briggs exactly where he figured he would, leaning against a post outside the saloon. Badge, catching what little light broke through the clouds, running his mouth loud enough for the street to hear about some poor soul he'd tossed out of town. Briggs didn't just abuse power, he needed an audience for it. Silas stopped 10 paces away. It took a moment for Briggs to notice him, but when he did, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Silas stood, too still, too certain. Maybe it was what he saw in his eyes. Briggs straightened, his hand slid casually toward his hip. "Well, well," he drawled, loud and performative. "Look who crawled out of the hills. What brings you to town, Ward? Finally feelin' sociable?" "I came to talk about—" Silas took a step closer. "I think you do. In fact, I think you know her better than most." The crowd was swelling now, pulled in by the electric charge that hung between the two men. Silas could feel every pair of eyes settle on him, could catch snippets of hushed voices rippling through the air. Perfect. He wanted every last one of them to see what was coming. "You got words for me, Ward? Then spit 'em out," Briggs barked, his fingers resting openly on the grip of his revolver, itching. Silas took a steady glance around the square. Merchants, ranchers, mothers clutching children peeking around skirts. These folks had endured Briggs' cruelty for years, forced to swallow it down with clenched teeth and bowed heads. "I'm saying you've been hurting a woman who works under my roof," Silas said, his voice ringing sharp through the still morning. "I'm saying you're a bully hiding behind a badge, using it to torment the helpless." The crowd froze, not a breath, not a shuffle. Even the horses seemed to catch the tension, pawing the dirt like something big was about to break. Briggs flushed red, then deepened to a purple shade of rage. "That's one hell of a charge, Ward. You got proof, or just your mouth to back it up?" Silas calmly reached into his vest and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "Yeah," he said, holding it up. "I do." Truth was, the page was blank. Something he'd grabbed off his desk in the rush out, but it didn't matter. The way Briggs' eyes locked onto it, frozen, exposed everything Silas needed to see. "The funny thing about secrets," Silas continued, slowly unfolding the paper for effect, "is they don't stay buried forever. They always find their way into the light." That's when Briggs went for his gun. His draw was quick, but Silas was already in motion. 15 years wrangling cattle and repairing fence posts had trained his body to react faster than thought. He dove left as the pistol cracked, the bullet slicing past his ear and smashing into the wooden post behind him. The townsfolk scattered in panic, but Silas was already rolling to his feet. Briggs was fumbling to cock his revolver again when Silas crashed into him like a thunderbolt, driving the air from his lungs and slamming them both hard into the saloon's outer wall. Glass rattled in the frames. They wrestled for the gun, Briggs snarling and flailing, but Silas's grip was forged from years of real work, and his arms knew how to overpower a man. He bent Briggs' wrist back until the deputy let out a bark of pain and released the gun. It clattered across the wooden walkway, stopping right in front of Marshal Kane's boots. Kane had arrived at the first sound of gunfire, gun drawn but lowered, calm and calculating. "That's enough," Kane barked, eyes sharp beneath his hat brim. "He jumped me," Briggs snapped. "Tried to kill me. Lock him up, Marshal." But Kane wasn't looking at Briggs. He was scanning the crowd. He could see it plain. The fear in their eyes wasn't for Silas. It was for what Briggs might do if he got away with this again. Something had changed today. Someone had finally had enough. "That true?" Kane asked the townsfolk, voice low but firm. "Ward here attack your deputy without reason?" A tense silence held over the street like a storm waiting to break. Then a frail voice rose. It was Mrs. Henderson, the old woman who ran the boarding house. Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. "Marshal," she said, "there's things you ought to know about your man there." "Don't listen to her!" Briggs snapped, sweat now visible along his hairline. "She's senile. They're all liars." But he couldn't stop what had already started. One by one, voices rose. The blacksmith stepped forward, telling how Briggs cornered his daughter behind the stable. A shopkeeper shared how money disappeared every time the deputy came snooping. Story after story poured out, each one another nail in the coffin. Kane's jaw tightened with each account, the color in his face fading to grim understanding. When the last tale fell quiet, Kane looked at Briggs, no anger, just something heavier, sadder. "Vernon," he said in a voice that left no room for excuses, "you best start telling me the truth about Mercy Whitmore." "I don't know anyone named." "Don't lie," Kane snapped, cutting through the words like steel. "Not to me. Not anymore." Silas stepped forward slowly, his palms still open and visible to the crowd. "Marshal," he said, steady and clear, "there's a young woman at my ranch who's been living in fear because of your deputy. She's got bruises that tell a story no honest man could ignore." Kane didn't answer right away. He just studied Silas. Long and hard. Everyone around knew what kind of man Ward was. Quiet, kept to himself, but when he spoke, his word carried weight. If he was breaking his silence now, it wasn't for nothing. "These are heavy accusations," Kane finally said, voice low but firm. "You better be sure." "They're lies," Briggs snapped, panic edging into his voice. "You're going to take their word over mine? I wear the badge." But that's when Silas reached into his pocket one last time and pulled out what he'd kept hidden until the moment was right. A torn scrap of cloth, frayed and dirty, same material, same pattern as the shirt Briggs was wearing right that second. He'd picked it up near Mercy's cabin that very morning, after the deputy had paid one of his visits. Now he held it up for all to see, high and steady. Kane's gaze moved from the fabric to Briggs, then back again. He didn't say a word at first. The sound of the cell door slamming shut behind Briggs echoed through Cedar Falls like thunder. Kane turned the key slowly, then hung it on the hook above his desk, where the whole town could see it. The man who once strutted with a badge now sat slumped on a hard bunk, his head in his hands, finally forced to face what he'd become. Outside the jail, Kane looked to Silas. "Bring Miss Whitmore to town tomorrow," he said. "She'll need to give her statement formally." Silas nodded. "She'll be here." Kane's voice lowered as he added, "And Ward, thank you." His eyes held regret. "I should have seen it, should have stepped in sooner." Silas gave a quiet nod. "We all should have. But it's done now." The ride home gave Silas time to think. About Mercy. About what healing would look like for someone who'd been looking over her shoulder for so long. But for the first time in months, she'd get to sleep without fear. When he reached the ranch, he found her sitting alone on the porch, eyes fixed on the mountains like she was seeing them new. As his horse approached, she stood slowly. Her expression was full of questions, but too afraid to ask them out loud. "It's over," Silas said, climbing down from the saddle. "He's in a cell where he belongs. He won't lay a hand on you, or anyone else, again." Mercy's knees buckled and she sank down onto the porch steps. For a second he thought she might faint. Then the tears came. Not the kind she'd cried before, not the silent ones she tried to hide. These were the kind that break open a dam, cleansing, real. "I thought he'd always have that power," she whispered. "You thought wrong," Silas said softly. "Sometimes it just takes one person saying, 'Enough.'" They sat together as the sun dropped behind the ridge, throwing golden light across the fields. Everything felt different. The ranch itself seemed to exhale. The weight finally lifted. "What happens now?" Mercy asked quietly. Silas took his time before answering. "Now you rest. Now you heal. And if you want to stay, there's always honest work here for someone who wants it." "And if folks start talking?" she asked. "Let 'em," Silas said. "Truth's got legs. It always catches up to the lies." As the first stars began to flicker overhead, Mercy smiled. It was faint, trembling, but it was real. And to Silas, who'd never been one for flowery words or dramatic speeches, that one smile made every risk worth it. Because sometimes, the battles that matter most aren't fought with bullets or fists. They're fought with a voice, a choice. The decision to take a stand when it counts. And sometimes when a quiet man finally finds his